The rope cut into my wrists, the bark of the pine tree scraping my back as Officer Caleb Reed's voice sliced through the dusk, sharp and venomous. "You think you're somebody, don't you?" I'm Zara Thompson, but he didn't know that, didn't want to know. 5 miles outside Missoula, Montana, the air was thick with pine and prejudice. And I stood bound, blood dripping from a gash above my eye, my heart pounding not from fear but from the fire of defiance. Wow. Reed's eyes burned with a mix of thrill and loathing, his badge glinting like a taunt as he leaned closer, his breath sour with coffee. "No ID, no story, just another scam artist," he spat, tugging the rope until my shoulders screamed. I didn't answer, didn't blink, my gaze locked on the fading light through the branches. A lifeline to the strength I'd honed over years in shadowed war rooms and crisis zones. I'm a federal crisis response strategist, a black woman who's outmaneuvered threats most couldn't imagine, but here, to Reed, I was just a target, my skin a crime in his eyes. My thoughts churned anger at his ignorance, grief for the history echoing in this moment, and a quiet resolve to let my silence speak louder than his hate. Reed was a man chasing ghosts, his rage rooted in a father who'd lost his badge too. A corruption scandal, leaving him obsessed with proving his control. His partner, Officer Mia Holt, a woman in her late 20s with sharp eyes and a nervous tic, rummaged through my bag 10 feet away, her hands trembling as she pulled out a dead phone and a worn notebook. "Nothing here," she muttered, glancing at Reed, her voice caught between duty and doubt. I saw her hesitation, the flicker of a conscience not yet buried under protocol. But she stayed silent, complicit in his script. My jacket was torn from the scuffle, my neck bruised where Reed's grip had tightened, yet I stood tall, drawing. On memories of my mother, who'd faced down gears in Birmingham's streets, her chin high, her spirit unbroken. I'd trained officers like Reed in de-escalation tactics in Seattle, taught them to see people, not threats, and the irony stung like the rope on my skin. Reed's radio crackled and he smirked, switching on his body cam, the red light a cold. "Lie." Subject resisted. "Required restraint," he said, his tone practiced, as if truth could be molded like clay. My chest tightened, not for me, but for every black person who'd faced this playbook without a witness. A pickup truck rumbled past, its driver, a Native American man named Eli Blackfeather. Slowing to stare, his face etched with concern. "Need help, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. Reed's eyes narrowed. "Keep driving, pal, unless you want to join her." Eli's gaze met mine, a silent apology in his eyes, and I felt the weight of his choice to move on, a choice I understood but wished he hadn't made. Reed laughed, a harsh bark, turning back to me. "Nobody's coming for you," he said, his words a blade meant to cut deep. I thought of my brother lost to a similar stop years ago, his name barely a footnote in a police report, and I vowed this wouldn't be my story. My silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy, a refusal, to let Reed's narrative erase me. I remembered my last mission, negotiating a hostage release in a desert outpost. Staying calm under pressure, and I channeled that now, my breath steady, despite the pain. Reed's confidence was a facade, his need to dominate born from a fear of being nothing without his badge. I saw it in his clenched jaw, the way he paced, seeking a reaction I wouldn't give. Holt, meanwhile, lingered by my car, her fingers tracing the edge of a hidden compartment she hadn't yet found, her face a mask of conflict. I wondered what drove her ambition, fear, or a past she couldn't escape. A jogger, Clara Ruiz, appeared on the trail 50 feet away, her phone in hand, her steps faltering as she saw me tied. Blood streaking my face. Her eyes widened, a mix of shock and guilt, but she didn't move closer, her hesitation a mirror to Eli's. I didn't blame them. Fear is a heavy chain. But Clara's phone rose slightly, capturing something, and I felt a spark of hope, not for rescue, but for truth. Reed noticed her, his smirk fading, and he stepped toward me, his voice low. "You're nobody out here," he whispered, his words a dare. My mind flashed to my team in D.C., colleagues who'd trusted my judgment in life-or-death scenarios, and I knew I was more than his lie. Holt's radio buzzed, and she murmured about calling it in, but Reed cut her off. Not yet. Let's make sure her story doesn't stick. His obsession with control was palpable. A man haunted by his father's fall, desperate to rewrite. It threw me. I thought of the cadets I'd mentored, their eager faces, and the betrayal of this moment burned. Clara lingered, her phone still raised, and I sensed her inner battle safety versus courage. Eli's truck was gone, but his glance lingered in my mind, a reminder of the world watching, even if silently. My wrists throbbed. My vision blurred from blood loss, but my heart held firm. Anchored by a truth Reed couldn't touch. I was Zara Thompson, a woman who'd faced down chaos and won. This rope, this tree, this moment, they wouldn't define me. They'd define him. Clara's silhouette faded into the dusk, but her small act, like a seed, promised something bigger. I didn't know then that her video would spark a fire, that Missoula's quiet hills would echo with voices demanding justice. All I knew was the sky above, the strength within, and the certainty that silence, when chosen, could be louder than any scream. The rope was gone, but its sting lingered on my wrists as I sat in the cold, gray isolation room at the Missoula police station, 5 miles from where Officer Caleb Reed had tied me to that pine tree. My name is Zara Thompson, but to the officers who dragged me here, I was still a nobody, a shadow they could dismiss. My forehead throbbed where blood had dried, my torn jacket a reminder of Reed's grip, but my heart burned with a quiet fire, fueled by the knowledge that truth has a way of breaking through, even when buried under lies. The fluorescent light buzzed above, casting a harsh glow on the blank report form in front of me, a phone within reach that I hadn't touched. I didn't need to call anyone. I'd learned long ago in crisis zones from Mogadishu to Kabul that silence can be a strategy, a way to let the world catch up to what you already know. My thoughts drifted to my last training session in Portland, Oregon, where I'd stood before a room of officers, teaching them to diffuse conflict without force, to see humanity before threat. The irony was a knife in my chest. Here I was, a national security coordinator with a decade of covert operations, reduced to a suspect because of my skin. I pictured Reed's face, his eyes wild with a need to dominate, driven by a past I could only guess at, a father's disgrace perhaps, or a life spent proving he was untouchable. His rage wasn't just personal, it was systemic, a badge-worn entitlement I'd seen too often in my work. The door creaked, and Sergeant Emily Torres stepped in, her face a mask of shock and recognition. I knew her from a federal workshop in Portland 2 years ago, where she'd sat in the front row, scribbling notes on my lecture about ethical policing. Her eyes locked onto mine now, wide with disbelief, as she clutched a faded conference folder. "Zara Thompson," she whispered, almost to herself, flipping to a photo of me speaking at the podium, my name printed below. Keynote speaker, crisis response strategies. My heart lifted, not for pride, but for the crack in the narrative Reed had tried to cement. Emily's hand shook as she set the folder down, her voice low but urgent. "You're not just anyone. You're the one who wrote the de-escalation protocols." I nodded, my throat tight, thinking of the countless hours I'd spent crafting those guidelines, hoping they'd protect someone like me. Emily's recognition was a lifeline, but it also stirred a grief I hadn't expected for. Every black person who'd faced this without someone to see them. I wanted to ask her why she hadn't questioned Reed earlier, but I saw the guilt in her eyes, a mirror to the hiker Clara's hesitation on that road. Emily wasn't the villain. She was caught in the same system I'd fought to reform. Outside, I heard Reed's voice, sharp and dismissive, arguing with Emily through the door. "She's a fraud, Torres. No badge, no proof. Just another con artist milking the system." His words were a performance, but beneath them, I sensed a crack in his armor, a fear that his control was slipping. Reed was a man haunted by failure, his father's fall from grace a shadow he couldn't escape. I'd read his type in personnel. Files officers who wielded power to mask insecurity, who saw blackness as a threat to their authority. My silence in that room wasn't surrender. It was a refusal to play his game. I thought of my mother's stories, her marches in Birmingham, How she'd face down hate with a steady gaze, and I drew strength from her legacy. Emily stepped out, her footsteps quick, and I knew she was digging deeper, pulling files, searching for truth. My mind flashed to my car, impounded nearby, where a hidden compartment held my classified ID and an encrypted communicator proof of who I was, but also a reminder of how little that mattered to Reed's prejudice. In the station's dispatch room, a young black man named Malik Evans sat at his console, his earpiece buzzing with routine calls. I didn't know him then, but I'd learn later he'd overheard Emily's revelation, his fingers pausing over his keyboard as he processed the weight of it. Malik was 25, new to the job. His dreams of justice, tempered by the reality of working under men like Reed. His heart raced as he typed a memo, his hands shaking not for fear of being caught, but for the fire of doing what was right. He sent it to a local activist group, a quiet act of rebellion that would ignite a spark. I pictured him, a kid not unlike my brother who'd believed in fairness until the system showed him otherwise. Malik's courage stirred something in me, a hope that the next generation could rewrite the script I was living. My thoughts were interrupted by Reed bursting in, his face flushed, his voice a low growl. "You think you're clever, staying?" "Quiet," he said, leaning over the table, his badge glinting like a weapon. I met his gaze, seeing the desperation beneath his bravado, a man who needed my fear to feel whole. I didn't give it to him. My silence was my power, a lesson I'd learned in high-stakes negotiations where words could betray more than they. Saved? Somewhere in Missoula, a vigil was forming in Riverfront Park, a new idea born from whispers of my story. Candles flickered, arranged to spell, "Who is she?" A question that cut deeper than any name. I didn't know it then, but Malik's memo had reached the right hands. People were gathering, their faces a mix of anger and hope. A young woman, a teacher named Aisha Brooks, stood among them, her voice trembling as she spoke of her own encounters with bias, her words weaving my story into hers. I thought of my trainees in Portland, how they'd listened when I spoke of empathy, and I wondered if any of them were out there now, rethinking their oaths. Reed's radio crackled again, and he stepped out, leaving me with Mia Holt, his partner, who lingered by the door. Her eyes darted to mine, conflicted, her fingers twitching like she wanted to speak but couldn't. Mia was younger, her ambition warring with her conscience, her silence a different kind than mine, not chosen, but imposed by fear of Reed's wrath. I saw her potential, the officer she could be if she broke free. And I felt a pang of empathy, remembering my own early days navigating a system that didn't always welcome me. My mind wandered to the car, to the communicator that could summon. My team in D.C., but I didn't need them yet. This wasn't about proving my rank. It was about exposing a truth bigger than me. I thought of the countless black women before me, unnamed in reports, their stories buried under resisted or non-compliant. My silence was for them a vow that this time the system wouldn't win. Emily returned, her face pale, clutching a printout of my federal clearance, her voice barely above a whisper. "Zara, you're with Strategic Operations. How did this happen?" I didn't answer. Not out of defiance, but because the question wasn't mine to answer, it was theirs. Reed's voice echoed from the hall, louder now, insisting I was a nobody. But I saw the doubt in Mia's eyes, a crack in the facade. Malik's memo was spreading, the vigil growing, and I felt the tide shifting. Not because of my title, but because of what my silence demanded: accountability. I thought of my grandmother, her stories of standing firm in the face of hate, and I knew this moment was bigger than me. It was a reckoning, and I was ready to let it unfold. The isolation room's walls seemed to close in. Hum of the fluorescent light, a constant reminder of the 5 miles that separated me from the pine tree where Officer Caleb Reed had bound me. His hate etched into every knot. I'm Zara Thompson, a federal crisis response strategist, but to the world beyond this Missoula police station. I was a viral image of a black woman tied, bloodied, and silent, my gaze piercing the dusk. My wrists still bore the rope's raw marks, my torn jacket hung loose, but my heart pulsed with a quiet certainty. The truth I'd held in silence was now a fire spreading beyond these walls. I sat upright, the untouched phone on the table, a symbol of my choice to let this moment unfold without my voice, a strategy I'd honed in crisis zones where timing was everything. My thoughts drifted to the vigil in Riverfront Park, where candles spelled, "Who is she?" Question I hadn't known was forming, but felt in my bones. I pictured the faces there, strangers united by a shared ache, and I wondered if they saw me not as a victim, but as a mirror to their own silenced truths. My mind flashed to Reed, his face twisted with a need to control, a man whose father's disgrace fueled a vendetta against anyone who challenged his power. His rage was a symptom of a system that rewarded his kind, and I felt a surge of resolve. To expose it, not for me, but for every black person whose story never reached the light. I didn't know then that Clara Ruiz, the jogger who'd hesitated on that trail, had uploaded a 20-second clip of me tied to the tree, her shaky footage, capturing Reed's sneer and my unyielding gaze. Shared from her phone 50 feet from the scene, it exploded online.
100,000 shares in 6 hours.
The hashtag know her name trending across platforms. Clara's guilt had driven her to act, her inner turmoil a battle between fear and courage. And I felt a pang of gratitude for her choice, however late. My heart swelled, thinking of my mother's marches in Birmingham, how one small act could ripple into a movement. Another video surfaced, leaked by Malik Evans, the young black dispatcher who'd sent my story into the world. This one, from Reed's body cam, showed him yanking my arm, his voice low and cruel. "Nobody cares what you are." The clip was raw, unedited, and it tore through social media. My silhouette becoming a profile picture for thousands, a silent protest that echoed louder than words. I imagined Malik at his console, his hands steady now, his fear replaced by purpose. A kid who'd seen too many injustices to stay quiet. His courage reminded me of my brother, whose life ended in a similar stop, and I vowed to honor them both. By letting this fire burn in Missoula, protests erupted outside the county courthouse. 3 miles from the station, signs reading "Justice for her" swaying in the crisp Montana air. I pictured Aisha Brooks, the teacher from the vigil, her voice rising above the crowd, weaving her own story of bias into mine, her strength a beacon for others. My chest ached with pride, not for myself, but for the community claiming my pain as their own. In Portland, Oregon, where I'd trained officers, students gathered at Pioneer Courthouse Square, their forums dissecting systemic racism, their voices carrying the lessons I'd taught but never expected to live. Chicago's Grant Park saw prayer circles, churches uniting across denominations, their hymns a plea for change. I thought of my grandmother, her faith unshaken despite hate, and I felt her spirit in those gatherings, a reminder that love could outlast cruelty. CNN and NPR aired Clara's clip, analysts drawing parallels to historical lynchings, a comparison that stung but rang true. Activists called it a modern spectacle of racism, and I felt the weight of their words, knowing my silence had forced the nation to look. Reed's presence lingered in my mind, his desperation growing as the station buzzed with whispers of my identity. I saw him in the hall earlier, arguing with Sergeant Emily Torres, his voice cracking as he dismissed her findings. She's nobody, just playing the system. But his eyes betrayed him, a flicker of doubt as the world closed in. Reed was unraveling his need for control, clashing with a reality he couldn't script. His father's shadow looming larger with every share of that video. Mia Holt, his partner, was quieter now, her nervous tick more pronounced. Her silence a different kind, born of fear, not choice. I wondered what held her back, what dreams she'd buried to follow Reed, and I hoped she'd find the strength to break free. My thoughts shifted to Ethan Brooks, a white college student I'd never met, who'd created a virtual reality simulation of my ordeal, a new idea born from guilt and empathy. Ethan, a tech major at the University of Montana, had watched Clara's clip and felt complicit in his silence, his privilege a weight he couldn't ignore. His VR program, shared across campuses, let users stand in my shoes, feel the ropes, bite, hear Reed's taunts, and it went viral, sparking tears and debates. I imagined Ethan, his hands shaking as he coded, his heart racing with purpose. And I felt a spark of hope for a generation willing to learn in Missoula's downtown. A mural rose on a brick wall near Kara's Park, my silhouette painted in bold strokes, crown of stars above my head, a new symbol of resistance. I didn't know it then, but artists led by Aisha had worked through the night. Their brushes a quiet rebellion, the mural a pilgrimage site for activists driving 200 miles to see it. My heart swelled, thinking of my trainees in Portland, some joining those protests, rethinking their badges. The fire of outrage wasn't just anger, it was love, a collective refusal to let my story fade. I thought of my brother, his name lost to a report, and I felt him in the crowd, his memory alive in their chants. Reed's radio crackled in the hall, reports of protests flooding in, and I sensed his panic. A man who'd believed his badge was a shield. Mia lingered nearby, her eyes darting to the door, her conflict palpable, and I willed her to see the truth. To choose courage over complicity. Malik's memo had grown into a movement, a small act, a seed that bloomed beyond Missoula, and I felt a surge of gratitude for his defiance. A kid who'd risked everything for me. The isolation room felt less confining now, the walls no longer a cage but a stage for what was unfolding outside. I thought of my mother's words. Hate can't stand when you shine. I wasn't shining for fame, but for every black woman whose light had been dimmed. My silence was a beacon, drawing the world's eyes to a truth they couldn't ignore. Ethan's VR, Aisha's mural, Claire's video, Malik's memo. They were threads in a tapestry of change, each acted defiance of Reed's lie that I was nobody. I pictured the vigil's candles, their glow a promise that this wasn't the end, but a beginning. My wrists ached, my bloodied forehead stung, but my heart was steady, anchored by a faith that justice, like sunlight, finds its way. Reed's voice faded in the hall, drowned by the roar of a world waking up, and I knew this moment, born of pain, would redefine not just me, but him and all who watched. The air in the Missoula police station felt different now, lighter, as if the walls themselves sensed the shift beyond them, 5 miles from the pine tree where I'd been bound. I'm Zara Thompson, a federal crisis response strategist, no longer. A silent figure in an isolation room, but a spark that had ignited a reckoning. My wrists still carried the rope scars. My forehead a faint mark where blood had dried, but my heart was steady, buoyed by the voices rising outside protests, prayers, and a mural that bore my silhouette. I sat in a small office, not a cell, waiting for clearance to leave, my torn jacket replaced by a borrowed sweater from Sergeant Emily Torres. My thoughts weren't on my pain, but on the fire I'd felt in Riverfront Park's vigil, the candles spelling "Who is she?" Now a question answered not by my name, but by the nation's response. I'd chosen silence, a strategy from years navigating global crises, and it had forced the world to speak for me. My mind lingered on Officer Caleb Reed, whose hate had tied me to that tree, his eyes haunted by a need to prove himself against his father's disgrace. He wasn't just a man, it was a symptom, a badge-wearing echo of a system that too often shielded cruelty. I felt no hatred, only a resolve to ensure his actions would redefine him, not me. Reed's downfall came swiftly, a storm I hadn't foreseen but felt in the station's tense whispers. He'd been arrested 3 days ago, 2 miles from here, his badge stripped after Clara Ruiz's video and Malik Evans's leaked body cam clip exposed his cruelty. Charged with 8 counts racial bias, torture, obstruction of justice, he faced 25 years in federal prison. His trial a spectacle broadcast on NPR and CNN. I saw him on a grainy TV in the office, his face defiant as he spoke on a local radio. Show his voice a desperate plea. I followed protocol. She was nobody, chest tightened. Not from anger, but from the weight of his lie. A lie that had silenced so many before me. Reed's words backfired, fueling protests in Missoula, Portland, and Chicago. His arrogance a match to the public's outrage. I thought of my mother, her Birmingham marches, how she'd faced men like Red with unyielding grace, and I drew strength from her memory, knowing this moment was bigger than his defeat. Reed's inner world, I imagined, was crumbling his father's scandal. A corruption probe that cost his family everything had left him chasing a legacy of control. My blackness, a canvas for his vendetta. His conviction wasn't justice yet. It was a step, a crack in the system's armor. Other voices rose, a chorus I hadn't expected but felt in my soul. Malik Evans, the young black dispatcher, led a campaign under hashtag Break the Silence, his memo. Now a beacon for survivors, Latina nurse Rosa Mendez spoke at a Missoula rally, her voice trembling as she recounted Reed pulling her from her car 4 years ago, accusing her of theft with no proof, her wrist bruised for weeks. I pictured Rosa, her hands steady as she saved lives, her courage a mirror to mine, and I felt pride for her defiance. A black veteran, Jamal Carter, shared on a live stream how Reed had shoved him against a wall in 2019 for looking suspicious. His military medals dismissed as props. Jamal's eyes, weary but fierce, reminded me of my brother, lost to a similar stop. And I vowed their stories wouldn't fade. These voices, unified by Malik's activism, painted Reed not as a lone villain, but as a product of a system that let him thrive. I thought of my Portland trainees, some now joining these rallies, their badges heavy with new questions, and I hoped they'd listen to Rosa, Jamal, and others whose pain had been buried. Mia Holt, Reed's partner, surprised me most. She'd stood silent as he tied me, her nervous tick a sign of her conflict. But now she'd testified against him, her voice cracking in court as she admitted her failure to act. Mia, I learned, was driven by a dream of proving herself in a male-dominated force, her fear of Reed's wrath silencing her conscience. Her testimony, 10 minutes that shook the courtroom, was a turning point, her guilt a bridge to redemption. I felt empathy for her, remembering my early days navigating a system that tested my resolve, and I hoped her choice would free her. Mia joined a restorative justice program, a new idea born from this case. Teaching rookies in Seattle about bias, her story, a warning and a hope. I imagined her in a classroom, her hands steady now, her voice carrying the weight of truth, and I saw potential in her. A woman who could reshape the badge she wore. The system itself began to bend. A change I hadn't dared dream of in that isolation room. The Carter Justice Act, named not for me, but for Jamal and others. Passed in Congress, mandating body cam audits and civilian oversight boards across the U.S., I felt a surge of hope. Thinking of my de-escalation protocols, once ignored by Reed, now required in police academies from Missoula to Miami, my heart swelled. Not for recognition, but for the lives these changes might save. A national day of witness. Another new idea emerged, urging citizens to record police interactions inspired by Clara's clip and Malik's leak. I pictured families in Chicago's South Side, phones ready, their courage a shield against men like Reed, and I felt their strength in me. My thoughts drifted to my grandmother, her faith in justice despite hate. I knew these reforms were her legacy too. Promise kept across generations. In Missoula, 2 miles from the courthouse, a community center hosted forums where Rosa, Jamal, and others shared their stories, their voices a tapestry of pain and power. I imagined Aisha Brooks, the teacher, moderating, her warmth uniting strangers, her own bias encounters fueling her resolve. My chest ached with gratitude for their courage, a reminder that justice wasn't Reed's prison cell, but the world they were building. Ethan Brooks, the student whose VR simulation had gone viral, spoke at one forum, his voice soft but firm, admitting his privilege had blinded him until my story woke him. I pictured Ethan, his hands coding late into the night, his guilt transformed into action, and I felt hope for a generation unafraid to change. Reed's shadow lingered, his conviction a warning to others like him. But his power was gone, stripped by voices he'd tried to silence. I thought of my brother, his name a whisper in my heart. And I knew this fight was for him, for Rosa, for Jamal, for all who'd been unseen, as I stood to leave the station. Ami handed me my classified ID, her eyes wet with unspoken apology. I nodded, not needing words. My silence still my strength. Outside, I heard chants from a rally, their rhythm a heartbeat of change. My wrists ached, my scars a map of survival, but my soul was light, lifted by a nation that had answered my silence. With a roar. Reed's defeat wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a promise that the system could learn, that hate could fall. I stepped into the Montana dusk, the air cool and clear, and I knew this moment born of pain would carry us forward, not as victims, but as architects of a world where no one is tied again. The Montana sky stretched wide above Missoula, its stars a quiet echo of the mural 2 miles away in Carr's Park, where my silhouette stood crowned with light, a symbol born from a moment of darkness. Zara Thompson, a federal crisis response strategist, no longer defined by the rope that once bound me to a pine tree 5 miles from this city's heart, but by the legacy that rose from my silence. My wrists carried faint scars, my torn jacket long replaced, yet my soul bore a deeper map, one of survival, defiance, and hope. I walked the streets of this town, unnoticed by most, my heart full with the weight of what had unfolded since that day. The protests, the mural, the candle spelling, "Who is she?" They weren't just about me, but about a nation forced to face its reflection. I'd chosen silence, a tactic from years in crisis zones, from negotiating in war-torn deserts. 2 briefing rooms in D.C., and it had become a beacon, amplifying voices I'd never met. My thoughts lingered on Officer Caleb Reed, now a name fading in a federal prison 800 miles away, his 25-year sentence a consequence of his hate. Reed wasn't just a man. It was a mirror to a system that had let him thrive, his need for control. A ghost of his father's disgrace, a fallen officer whose shadow drove him to break others. I felt no joy in his fall, only a resolve that it mark a turning point for those still bound by prejudice. I'd turned down every interview. From NPR's earnest calls to CNN's polished offers, my voice steady when I told them, justice doesn't need a microphone. My heart carried my mother's Birmingham marches, her unyielding grace against hate, and I knew my silence honored her. Letting others speak where I'd stood quiet. Instead, I taught in small police academies in rural Oregon, 300 miles from Missoula, under a plane named Zara. No rank, no history. My classes asked cadets to face the unknown. What do you see when there's no name, no badge? Their hesitant answers, scribbled in notebooks, stirred hope in me, a belief that the next generation could unlearn the biases I'd faced. Thought of Aisha Brooks, the teacher whose vigil had lit the spark, now leading community workshops in Missoula, her warmth weaving stories of bias into lessons of empathy. Aisha's eyes, bright with purpose, reminded me of my grandmother, whose faith outlasted cruelty. And I felt her spirit in every word Aisha spoke, uniting strangers across divides. Letters poured in, each one a pulse of the movement I hadn't sought but cherished. A black teen, Marcus Lee, wrote from Chicago, his words raw. Your silence gave me courage to speak after they called me a thug for my backpack. My chest tightened, picturing Marcus, his dreams echoing my brother's. Lost to a badge years ago, and I vowed his voice would not be silenced. A white retiree, Ellen Harper, sent a note from Portland. I was Clara, frozen, ashamed. You showed me how to step forward. Ellen's transformation, from bystander to advocate, filled me with gratitude. A reminder that change crosses all lines. I kept these letters on my desk, unframed, alive, a testament to pain turned into power. Clara Ruiz, the jogger, whose video had ignited this fire, now spoke at forums 50 miles away. Her guilt reshaped into a call for action, her voice steady as she urged others to witness. I pictured Clara, her hands no longer trembling, her courage a ripple from that Montana trail, and I felt pride for her journey, a mirror to my own. Ethan Brooks, the student whose VR simulation had touched hearts, launched a virtual Zara Thompson. Archive with Clara, a digital sanctuary for unsung stories, Black nurses, Latino drivers, Native elders, all dismissed until shared. I imagined Ethan coding through sleepless nights, his privilege a tool for justice, his empathy born from my ordeal. The archive, lived for 6 months, held tales that reached 100,000 readers, a chorus against silence. My heart lifted, thinking of my Portland trainees, some now contributors, their stories building bridges where walls once stood. Malik Evans, the dispatcher whose memo had sparked the movement, was now an organizer in Missoula. 3 miles from the courthouse, his eyes fierce, with purpose. Malik's courage, born from seeing too many injustices, was my brother's legacy reborn, and I vowed to honor it. My silence a canvas for his voice. The pine tree, 5 miles from town, stood ringed by painted stones. Dignity, truth, courage, a memorial tended by locals, not with plaques, but with quiet care. I visited once, my steps slow, my heart full, seeing children add pebbles, their parents whispering of change. An annual walk of witness, a new tradition. Retrace my path from the tree to Riverfront Park, 2 miles of silence where Black, white, Native, and Latino neighbors walked together, Aisha's hymns guiding them. I joined last year unnoticed, my soul soaring as I felt my mother's sit-ins in their steps. Schools taught my story, not by name, but as a question. Who is the unknown? Students in Chicago wrote essays echoing Marcus's letter, their hearts learning to see beyond. Skin. My silence had become a lesson, not of victimhood, but of power. A truth stronger than Reed's hate. Reflecting on my journey, I see the rope not as a chain, but as a turning point. I learned that silence, when chosen, can roar louder than words, forcing systems to face their flaws. I learned that courage isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's a steady gaze, a refusal to be erased. My grandmother taught me to stand tall, my mother to march on, and this ordeal taught me that one moment can spark 1,000 others. From Claire's video to Malik's memo, from Ethan's archive to Aisha's workshops, I learned that justice isn't a verdict but a collective awakening, a promise kept by those who refuse to look away. My scars remind me of the pain, but the stones, the walk, the letters, they remind me of the power in us all. I think of Reed, his cell a cold end, and I know his story isn't mine. Mine is the world that rose after him, the voices that refused silence. If you were in a similar situation, facing systemic racism and policing, implicit bias and stereotyping, and a culture of training that often fails to see the human before the threat, how would you approach it to achieve the best possible outcome? Would you speak, record, teach, or stand silent, letting truth find its way? My journey showed me that change begins when one person dares to act, whether with a phone, a memo, or a story shared. The best outcome isn't just a conviction. It's a system that learns, a community that heals, a world where no one is bound for being who they are. As I stood under the Oregon stars, 300 miles from Missoula, I felt my grandmother's faith, my mother's fire. And I knew this wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a vow that no Black woman, no Marcus, no Jamal would be tied again, because we'd chosen to see, to speak, to shine.